Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the convocation today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Sangeet-Richard Downs. Some faculty members may remember Richard from his time here in the early 90s. He was a student of mine, and he studied here at Carnegie Mellon for his master's degree. He's here to talk about his journey through music. And his journey, his story, is fascinating, interesting, and very relevant to what we are facing today in the field of music. One of the most important things that all of you young people need to keep in mind is that it is no longer just about getting your education, taking an audition, winning a job, and then sitting in that chair for 50 years of your life. If you want to have a really happy and productive career in music, you need to be ubiquitous, you have to be versatile, you have to be flexible. And nobody that I know embodies that philosophy and has found a niche for himself more than Richard. So I'd like to introduce Richard. I don't want to go through his bio because I think the bio is written in the programs. But very briefly, Richard, once he graduated from here, he went to Puerto Rico, from where he's from, and he played in the Puerto Rico Symphony for 14 years and found himself at a crossroads emotionally and career-wise, philosophically and musically. And his journey really begins about that time. So please welcome Richard Downs. Thank you.
Thank you, maestro. Good afternoon. I would like to thank Professor Cardenes and the Carnegie Mellon School of Music for giving me this opportunity to share with you today. To begin, first of all, for a few minutes, we will hear a collage of some of my work to illustrate some of the main ideas of this talk. 21st century classical music is a diverse art form. Some elements of the previous century have been retained, but there is a growing move towards postmodernism, polystylism, and eclecticism, which seek to incorporate elements of all styles of music, irrespective of whether these are classical or not. These efforts represent a slackening differentiation between the various musical genres. Pop, jazz, rock, world, and others are seen as styles to be used in any work, rather than as separate disciplines. I will speak, obviously, from the perspective of a classically trained musician who began and finished his formal training as a classical violinist. After finishing a graduate degree from CMU, I got the position as section violin with the Puerto Rico Symphony Orchestra, a position I held until 2007. The first few years were very exciting, as one can imagine, having gotten a real job with a major Latin American symphony orchestra. But after several years, I lost that initial excitement towards music, and I developed a longing for some kind of alternate outlet to try to reinvigorate the lost passion. I was also looking for a different approach that would help me deal with the severe anxiety, the stage fright, and the stress I was experiencing because of the highly competitive, demanding, and perfectionistic environment at that moment. Some fortunate and brave souls can thrive and enjoy such pressure, but I was not one of them. As it is sometimes said, one's weakness can become one's strength. What I mean is that this predicament forced me to search for a more personal way to approach music, a way that was more in accord with my own temperament, my own nature. There were some key colleagues and other musician friends who were instrumental in opening my mind and influencing me towards this way of thinking. Some of these colleagues were the ones who at times, after playing a Mahler symphony one night, I would see them playing Latin jazz in some club a few hours later. I saw a joy and ease about their attitude to making music, and I wanted that. To be able to create spontaneously a phrase, a melody, a harmony that would reflect what I was feeling, thinking, and experiencing at that very moment. Ever since I tried to create like that, I felt I found my musical path. Or at least I felt closer to what is meant by the phrase, being you. It was like an epiphany, and I have not looked back since. And that brings us to the second idea. Improvisation is the practice of acting, singing, talking, and reacting, of making and creating in a moment and in response to the stimulus of one's immediate environment and inner feelings. I will read a quote from an interview with Robert Levin, who as a performer, besides being a composer, is known for attempting to recreate performance practice from the time of the composer, such as improvising cadenzas. Quote, "Here is something fascinating about the act of musical improvisation. That moment when a musician departs from the score, embarking on a thematically relevant, yet wholly spontaneous composition. We normally think of it as the province of jazz musicians, conjuring the iconic image of a sax player wailing through reeds in a smoky, dim-lit club. John Coltrane and Bill Evans were masters. Miles Davis was never much for rehearsal. He used to gather his band in the studio, rattle off a few suggestions for the broad shape each track should take, and hit record. But many of the early classical composers, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, and Liszt, were also known for improvising entire portions of their concerts. Liszt had a penchant for soliciting musical themes from his audience. Before a show, anyone could jot down a few bars of melody on a piece of paper. Some were original, others were bits of recognizable tunes from the time, a popular symphony or aria. Liszt would then pull one of these melodies out of a hat and use it as a launching pad. He would reharmonize it or play it backwards, always resting from it, a spirited improvisation that could last for several minutes. Regardless of genre, the appeal of improvisation is its danger. It's an act of audacity, says Levin, but ultimately an act of profound humanity, given that it's a communication between the performer and the audience. The musician takes a huge risk, trusting, hoping that his brain and fingers will successfully allow him to walk the tightrope over the precipice and arrive at the other side, Levin says. Or you might crash and burn. You never know. But the spectators, as they live vicariously through the musician's adventure, love him for it. How do improvisers do this? When he's ready to begin a cadenza, Levin says, he doesn't have a plan. As many other seasoned improvisers claim, he just starts playing. It's intuitive, but Levin admits he didn't always know how to improvise. He had to learn. The joy of creating, improvising, or composing in real time, in other words, recombining melodic, rhythmic, and harmonic material the way one most sincerely and honestly conceives it, is what I call finding your own voice. And this brings us to the next idea in this talk. After several years of experimentation with improvisation in the different genres at that time, New Age, rock, funk, Indian raga, fusion jazz, and many other kinds of improvisatory expressions, I began to write down some of these recorded improvisations with some contemporary modern classical composition techniques. Practices in the past championed by composers and improvisers such as Gunther Schuller, George Russell, and Charles Mingus, known as the third stream, which is a term coined by Schuller in 1957 describing the synthesis of classical music and jazz improvisation. I see improvisation and formal composition basically as being on the same continuum. The only difference is time. Brahms himself declared that his first symphony, from sketches to finishing touches, took 21 years, from 1855 to 1876. When you improvise, you don't have that much time. Time allows us to think about how to manipulate melodies, harmonies, and rhythms in retrograde, inversions, diminution, augmentation, and we can patiently construct our ideas and preserve them for posterity. I immerse myself in the improvisational and compositional side of music, but because I made and still make a living as an orchestral violinist, I was looking also to improve and to rejuvenate my violin technique, and began to read a bit more in depth about the lives and practices of the great violinists of the past centuries, such as Wieniawski, Isai, Wietain, Spohr, Sarasate, Ševčík, Enescu, Joachim, Paganini, Kreisler, etc. These were all very different from each other. They developed their own personal sounds, their own personal techniques, exercises with strong individualities, and they were also all composers. I like the idea of being a violinist composer like those luminaries of the past, something that now it is much easier than ever before to attempt, thanks to modern technology. With the growing popularity of the home computer and the vast improvements in music production applications during the 21st century, home-based composers and performers are no longer limited to the facilities of designated recording studios. Sorry, Ricardo. Home users can now quickly and easily sample, record, and produce their own music using their own home recording studios and promote it via the internet, which is how I operate. Advances in computer power and software for manipulation of digital media have dramatically affected the way computer music is generated and performed. Current generation microcomputers are powerful enough to perform very sophisticated audio synthesis using a wide variety of algorithms and approaches. Outside the traditional approaches to composition and performing orchestral, operatic, and chamber classical music of the 18th and 19th century, with the exception of film music, computer music systems are now commonplace and so firmly embedded in the process of creating music that we hardly give them a second thought. I am glad I'm giving this talk in Carnegie Mellon University, a mecca of computer science and technology. I hope then that most of us classical musicians will not see the advances in computer music intelligence as a disagreeable event, but as a welcome tool that allows us to unleash our creativity. For the first time in history, we now musicians have the capability that painters in the past had, that is, complete control over vision. What I mean is that one can compose an orchestral score with a sampled major orchestra or any other kind of combo one wishes to realize, and realize it immediately. Play all the instruments via a MIDI keyboard controller and even record them in the comfort of your own bedroom. Something a control freak like me found very fortunate indeed. Not only that, there are programs that make the correct inversion and suggest the common practice chord progressions in the style of Brahms, if one wishes to compose a traditional 19th century symphonic work. At the present time, there are young generation composers, some very successful, creating these huge orchestral pieces or writing for film, sometimes very beautiful, without even knowing how to read music. I don't say this to demean their creations. I love and have been inspired by many of them. On the contrary, more power to them. Just imagine how much more can those who have the skills, the knowledge, and the experience do with such technological capabilities at their disposal. Thank you. I'm going to improvise something live.